The device was so small I almost missed it. A black rectangle barely bigger than a stick of gum, tucked under the lip of the center console where the fabric meets the plastic. I only found it because I dropped my lip balm and reached under the seat to fish it out, and my fingers found something that shouldn't have been there. I pulled it out and held it in the light. It had a tiny microphone grill on one side, a USB port on the other, and a small red light, blinking slowly, that had apparently been blinking for quite some time. Someone had been listening to everything in my car. I sat in the parking lot of the grocery store for a long time, holding that device, running through the list of people who had access to my car. The list was short. It had one name on it: my husband, Daniel. My name is Sarah Hollins. I'm 27 years old, and I have been married to Daniel for 3 years. He is a project manager, a weekend cyclist, a man who folds laundry with a precision that I once found endearing and now understand was simply control wearing a domestic costume. He had always needed to know things: where I was going, who I was meeting, why I was 20 minutes later than I said I'd be. I had explained this to myself for 3 years, as love, as caring, as the particular attentiveness of a man who had been hurt before and needed reassurance. I had been very patient with that explanation. I had given it every benefit of every doubt I had. But this was not attentiveness. This was not love. This was a recording device tucked under my center console, blinking quietly in the dark, capturing every phone call, every conversation, every private word I had said in my own car for however long it had been sitting there. I put it in my coat pocket. I bought my groceries. I drove home. And that night, while Daniel watched television in the living room, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and I figured out how to access what was on it. What I found on that recording changed everything. Not in the way Daniel had intended, in quite the opposite way, actually. The device had been in my car for 6 weeks. I know this because the recordings were time-stamped, and the first one was dated a Tuesday in early October. A Tuesday I remembered, actually, because Daniel had asked to borrow my car that morning to run errands while his was in for service, and I had handed him the keys without thinking. He had returned my car 2 hours later. He had also, apparently, used those 2 hours to install a listening device in the center console. I listened to the first few recordings with the particular nausea of someone hearing their own private life played back without permission, my phone calls with my sister, a voice memo I had recorded to myself about a grocery list, a conversation with my friend Patrice where I talked about being tired, about feeling like something was off in the marriage, about not being able to name what it was. I paused on that one for a moment. I had been right that something was off. I had simply been wrong about the direction it was coming from. Then I got to the recording from 3 weeks ago, a Thursday evening around 7. Daniel's voice clear and close, which meant the device had been in the car and Daniel had been in the car, which meant, and this took me a moment to process, that at some point Daniel had gotten into my car while I was not in it and had made a phone call. He had forgotten the device was in there, or he had not thought about it. Or most likely, he had been so accustomed to the surveillance flowing one direction, from him toward me, that it had simply not occurred to him that the device recorded everything, including him. The call lasted 11 minutes. I will not describe everything that was said in those 11 minutes. Some of it I will carry for a long time regardless of whether I describe it. But what I will say is that by the end of those 11 minutes, I had the full shape of something I had been sensing for months without being able to see clearly. A name, a timeline, specific details that no innocent explanation would account for. His own voice, his own words. He had bugged my car to find out what I was doing. Instead, he had recorded himself. I closed the laptop. Daniel was still watching television. I could hear the low murmur of it through the wall, the ordinary soundtrack of an ordinary evening in a house that was no longer what I had believed it to be. I made tea. I thought about what came next. I was not going to handle this impulsively. I was not going to walk into the living room shaking. I was not going to give Daniel the version of me that was frightened or unraveled, because that was the version he had been counting on. The version a man installs surveillance equipment to produce. The version that reacts before she thinks. I am not that version. I never have been. I have always been the version that thinks first. My friend Patrice had been waiting for me to see this for longer than I had. She did not say this directly when I called her. She was not the kind of person who says I told you so, which is one of many reasons she has been my closest friend since college. But I could hear it in the specific quality of her silence when I told her what I had found. The silence of someone setting down something they have been holding for a while. She said, "How are you?" I said, "Clear." She said that was the right answer. Patrice had a friend who was a family law attorney. She texted me the name and number before we had even finished the call. The attorney's name was Diane, and when I met her the next morning, she looked at the recording device, listened to the audio file I had copied to my phone, and said 3 things in sequence. First, that placing a recording device in another person's vehicle without consent was illegal in our state. Second, that the recording itself, having been made by the device Daniel installed, was admissible in divorce proceedings precisely because he had created it. Third, that I had more than enough. She said that last part with the quiet satisfaction of someone who appreciated a well-constructed irony. I asked her to prepare the paperwork. She said she would have it ready within the week. She also said, and this was the part I had already decided on my own, but it was useful to hear confirmed, that how I chose to present this to Daniel before the formal process began was entirely my decision, and that whatever I chose, she would support it. I knew what I was going to do. I had known since the moment I sat in that parking lot and looked at the blinking red light. I was going to let Daniel hear himself, his own voice, his own words, from the device he had put in my car to monitor me. I was going to sit across from him and press play and give him the specific experience of listening to himself, say the thing he had been certain I would never find out. I was not going to perform it. I was not going to build up to it dramatically or deliver it with a speech. I was simply going to let the recording do the work because the recording was better than anything I could have scripted. If you're here, listening to this, thank you. Genuinely. If this story is connecting with you, a like and a subscription means everything to me. It's what keeps these stories coming to you. I had 3 days before the moment I had chosen. 3 days of ordinary evenings, of dinner and television and Daniel asking about my day with the specific interest of someone who already knows the answer because he has been listening to recordings of it. I gave him ordinary answers. I was warm and present and gave him nothing to read in my face. I was very good at this by then. 3 years of managing my reactions to Daniel's control had, it turned out, prepared me perfectly for 3 days of managing them one last time. On Saturday morning, I asked him to sit down with me at the kitchen table. I said I wanted to share something with him. He sat down. He looked at me with the careful expression of someone who monitors his wife and therefore believes he has no surprises coming. I put my phone on the table between us. I pressed play. The first few seconds of the recording were ambient sound. Road noise, the faint hum of the car's engine, the small ordinary sounds of someone settling into a seat. Daniel recognized these sounds before he recognized the voice. I watched his face as it happened. The moment the ambient sounds registered, the specific sound of my car's interior, which he knew as well as any space he occupied regularly, something shifted behind his eyes. Then his own voice came through the speaker. It was strange, I imagine, to hear yourself in that particular way. Not the voice you perform for others, not the voice you use in public or at dinner or in the careful daily construction of being a husband. The voice you use when you believe no one is listening. The voice that does not bother to sound like anything other than exactly what it is. His face went through several things in quick succession: recognition, calculation, the specific expression of someone running through options at speed and finding none of them useful. He reached for the phone. I picked it up before he could and held it in my hand while the recording continued. I did not say anything. There was nothing I needed to say. His voice was saying everything. When the 11 minutes were finished, I set the phone back on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn, and the ordinary sound of it felt almost funny. The world continuing its Saturday business while the architecture of 3 years came apart at our kitchen table. Daniel said my name. I looked at him. He said he could explain. I said I did not need an explanation. I said I had the explanation. I said it was 11 minutes long, and I had already listened to it several times and found it very thorough. He said it wasn't what it sounded like. I said it sounded exactly like what it was, and that was fine, because I was not asking him to characterize it. I was simply sharing it with him, the way he had been sharing my private conversations with himself for 6 weeks. He looked at the device which I had placed on the table beside my phone. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "You found it." I said, "The lip balm found it, technically." He did not seem to find this funny. I found it a little funny. I had been finding small things funny for 3 days in the specific way that happens when you have made your decision and are on the right side of it. I told him Diane's office would be in touch. I told him I would be staying at Patrice's for the next week while arrangements were made. I told him I hoped sincerely that he would handle the proceedings respectfully, and that I intended to do the same. Then I picked up the bag I had already packed. I had packed it Thursday quietly while he was on his evening run, and I walked out of the kitchen. At the door I paused. Not for drama. I had genuinely forgotten my umbrella, which was by the door, and I picked it up and tucked it under my arm. Daniel was still sitting at the kitchen table when I closed the door behind me, his own voice still in the air. Patrice opened her door before I had finished knocking. She took one look at my face. "Calm," she said later, like someone who has just finished a long project, and said, "How did he look?" I said, "Like a man who had just listened to himself." She said, "Good." We sat in her kitchen for 2 hours, and I told her everything in order, from the parking lot to the pressed play to the umbrella. She listened with complete attention and laughed in exactly the right places, which is a gift not everyone has. When I finished, she refilled my tea and said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" She said, "He put the thing in your car to catch you doing something wrong, and the only person it caught was him." I said I had been thinking about that too. There is a specific satisfaction in that kind of irony that is different from regular satisfaction. It is not the satisfaction of having won something. It is the satisfaction of the universe being, briefly and precisely, logical. A man who surveils his wife out of his own guilt records himself by accident. The evidence he created to use against her becomes the evidence that ends him. The trap closes on the person who set it. I did not feel triumphant exactly. Triumph implies a competition, and I had not been competing with Daniel. I had simply been living my life in my own car, not knowing I was being recorded, until I found a device that turned out to contain something much more useful than anything he had been looking for. The divorce proceedings, handled by Diane with the efficiency of someone who had all the documentation she needed before the other side had decided on a strategy, were completed in 4 months. The recording, as Diane had predicted, was admissible and persuasive. The fact that Daniel had illegally placed a listening device in my vehicle was also documented and noted. He did not contest the key terms. His attorney, I was told, had advised him that contesting them would not go well. I will give Daniel this. He did not make it ugly. Whatever else he was, he understood when a position was indefensible, and he did not spend money and time defending it anyway. The proceedings were clean. The outcome was fair. I walked out of it with my half of what we had built, which was more than enough to start something new. The recording device. The small black rectangle that had been blinking in my center console for 6 weeks, I gave to Diane as evidence and never saw again. It had done its work. More work than Daniel had intended, considerably more useful work than he had planned for. I thought of it sometimes as a kind of accidental ally, the surveillance that surveilled the surveiller. That is the kind of thing that should happen more often. Spring came into my new apartment the way good things come, quietly on its own schedule, without being asked. I had found the place in February, a third-floor one-bedroom with a window above the kitchen sink that looked out over a row of maples and that let in the kind of morning light that makes even ordinary coffee feel like a considered choice. I had furnished it slowly, on purpose. One thing at a time, each one mine alone. No compromises, no one else's preference folded into the decision. A couch in a color Daniel would have called too much. Shelves I assembled myself with moderate success, and one remaining mystery screw. A kitchen table where I sat in the mornings and did not have to manage anyone else's mood before I had finished my first cup. It was, I discovered, an enormous relief to live in a space that did not require monitoring. Patrice came over most weekends. She had strong opinions about the couch color. She liked it. And about the mystery screw, she said it was character. And about the general state of my life, which she assessed as considerably improved. I agreed with all three assessments. Daniel and I had not spoken since the morning I left. His attorney communicated with Diane. That was the appropriate channel, and we used it. I did not miss the conversations. We had not, I understood now, been having real ones for some time. We had been having managed ones. The kind where one person is listening for information and the other is performing normalcy without knowing it. I thought about that sometimes, about how long I had been performing normalcy inside a marriage that was not normal, about how much energy that takes, the kind you don't notice you're spending until you suddenly aren't spending it anymore and you feel the return of it like waking up after a long sleep. I called my sister on Tuesdays from my car. I talked about whatever I wanted. I said private things without wondering who was listening. The car was just a car again. The ordinary metal container that moved me from one part of my life to another, carrying nothing it wasn't supposed to carry. That sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. Here is what I know now, at 27, sitting at my kitchen table in the morning light of an apartment that is entirely mine. Control dressed up as love is still control. Daniel had framed his surveillance as care, as the behavior of a man who worried, who needed reassurance, who had been hurt before. I had accepted that framing for 3 years because I wanted to believe it, because love wants to believe the best version of the story it's been given. But a man who loves you does not install recording equipment in your car. A man who trusts you does not need to verify where you've been. A man who is honest with you does not surveil you to protect his own dishonesty, which is, of course, what this was. Daniel was not surveilling me because he suspected me of anything. He was surveilling me because he was doing something he did not want me to find out about, and guilty people surveil the people around them the way they surveil themselves, looking for the moment the truth becomes visible. He made the device to catch me. He caught himself. There is justice in that. Not the loud kind, not the movie kind, the quiet, exact kind that arrives without fanfare and closes the loop that should have been closed from the beginning. What I carry forward is not bitterness. Bitterness would require me to keep giving Daniel space in my head, and he does not deserve that real estate. What I carry forward is clarity. The clarity of a woman who found a blinking device under her center console on an ordinary Thursday, pressed play on a recording her husband made by accident, and understood, completely, finally, without any room for doubt, exactly what she was dealing with and exactly what to do about it. I dealt with it. I pressed play. And then I picked up my umbrella and I walked out the door. Some things are just that simple.